All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I get the post-lunch session when hopefully you're not in a food coma. The good news is we're going to cover a lot of material, and the bad news is we're going to cover a lot of material because I'm going to speak a mile a minute. So we're going to rock through a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to start with the landscape. We run $1.5 billion of venture capital money, and we are co-invested with Amazon in a bunch of stuff. Some of the stuff we do is pretty cutting edge in science fiction. That's going to be one of the motifs that I talk about the closing gap between sci-fi and sci-fact. But I'm going to start with some principles about how we look at the world and the kinds of things that guide us into investing. Right now, there is a ton of money in very small VCs. There's a ton of money in the very large SoftBank-like VCs. It's creating an environment that we think is a little bit crazy. We are starting a lot of new companies with founders and entrepreneurs. We think it's a particularly good time to do that kind of thing. And valuations right now are pretty high. This is a phenomenon that I capture which describes the cost of capital. Right now, cost of capital globally is about negative 40 basis points. For all intents and purposes, it's basically zero. And I consider this a tractor beam for the future. This is taking far-out ideas that would have been 20 years hence in the future and basically turning them into 20-month frenzied projects. If and when the cost of capital rises, the kinds of moonshots that you may see that many people are undertaking would start to be reined in. Today, we're in a good time for some of these big moonshots. At Lux, everybody has been indoctrinated with a few different ideas. One of them is that 100% of the information we have right now is based on the past. And 100% of the value of the information that we are going to analyze is based on the future, which is inherently unknowable and probabilistic. The best definition of risk for us is that more things can happen than will. And so we are constantly thinking about the good and the bad that might happen. I am a little bit more of the cynic. My co-founder Peter is like my partner Bilal, who tends to wear bright red pastel colors, and I'm generally like the princess of darkness in all black, expecting the worst. And a mantra that is risk management for us at a venture capital fund is that failure comes from a failure to imagine failure. So if you can think about all the bad stuff that can go wrong and then throw time or talent or money at it, you can increase the odds that you don't suffer from some catastrophic failure. A few of the themes that I'm going to cover across the portfolio range from the sci-fi-like phenomenons, from space and satellites to autonomous fleets to brain and machine interfaces, an area that I'm particularly excited about. And I'm going to also talk about where we get edge, which is how can you as an investor or an entrepreneur get an advantage? How can you think differently than other people, and where do you do that? I call this time arbitrage and science fiction, and as you'll see, these are two themes. And it begs the question of where to focus, and I'm going to invoke ghosts. So I'm going to start with where to get edge, which is time arbitrage and science fiction. There are basically three sources of edge that anybody can have in any field, whether you're an investor, or you're an analyst, or you're an entrepreneur. The first is informational. Can you get more information than other people? If you're a public market investor, there's legal limitations to that. If you're a private market investor, you can get asymmetric sources of private information. Second is how you analyze that information. And so if you analyze it closer to ground truth than somebody else, then you might have an advantage. And that's also really hard because you have a lot of smart people that are competing and basically looking at the same piece of information and putting their analytic rigor on it. The third is the one timeless source of edge, which is behavioral, which is, if somebody is generally looking out, 6 months and they're trying to basically find the next, .com or enterprise software company or advertising-driven company, you have a lot of competition doing that. There's far fewer people that are doing the kinds of things that you see at Mars. I think in total there's something like 25 VCs here. And I think it's endemic of the fact that it's harder to do. So behavioral is a one source of advantage. Part of the behavioral is thinking differently than other people. This is a famous experiment some of you have seen. It's called the Solomon Asch experiment, named after the researcher. The guy that's circled right there is the mark. Everybody else is in on the joke. And basically what they're going to do is lie, and he's going to look at ground truth and say, no, you guys are a bunch of idiots. And then they're going to do it a second time, and you're going to see how quickly he conforms to the crowd.
In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1.
1. 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3.
3.
3. 3.
That's it. That's it. It took a second try, and before you know it, you're running with the herd, right? So it really takes a behavioral disposition that's different, that says, you know what, I'm willing to think differently, and in our world, it's willing to take a longer time horizon. So time arbitrage, being able to think 5 or 10 years further out than other people, I think is the one source of really timeless advantage. If you take those lines, you flip them, that's the time arbitrage. You're familiar, of course, with Odysseus, tying himself to the masses and the marshmallow test. I'm going to skip this. Again, for us as a venture capital fund, you get a 10-year lock of capital. So I don't have to worry about what happens in the next year or two. I have 10 years to try to figure it out. Second, where to focus, ghosts. What do I mean by that? We're a New York and Menlo Park firm in New York, where our old office used to be right by the New York Public Library. And there were these placards along this library way, and they were very inspiring because there were these quotes. And this one always caught me. The reading of good books is like a conversation with the best men of past centuries. So you get to read all these brilliant people that died. Well, the people that I like to invoke, the ghost, are Fitzgerald, Twain, and Schopenhauer. Each one of these people had a famous quote that basically, in my mind, tells you where you should or shouldn't look. Okay, so start with Fitzgerald. His famous quote was that the test of a first-rate intellect is the ability to hold two opposing ideas at your head at the same time and still retain the ability to function. So you can think about this, a Fitzgerald situation, as something like gold. Gold is a shiny piece of metal. Gold is a great store of value in an otherwise fiat currency world. China is an engine of growth, or China is a bubble waiting to collapse, and there's nothing but lies, damn lies, government statistics, and Chinese government statistics. And it's a bubble that's going to pop. What you can predict amongst this uncertainty is the certainty of the volatility between two equally cogent sides, between really smart people that are basically arguing. And in our view, the best thing to do is to sit this out. Just don't play the game. This is front page news. This is what everybody is focused on, and I think it's generally a waste of time. The second situations, which are instructive, are Twain situations. These are situations where his famous dictum was, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. So what are examples of this? The housing market, right? People thought housing prices could only go up, and then you had this really low probability, high magnitude collapse of the housing crisis. The Turkey Growth Index. If you are a turkey and you are born, every day of your life gets better and better and better. You get fatter and fatter and fatter until Thanksgiving. And so again, this sort of, Nassim Taleb like black swan, low probability, high consequence event. Venture capital and luck's where we live is the world of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's famous quote was that talent is hitting a target that no one else can hit. Genius is hitting a target that no one else can see. These are the people who have arrogance of the highest order. They say that this is the way the world ought to look, and they go create it. So this is talent.
Final seconds of the third, and here's Wade. Got it! A third!
This is also talent, although it's a little bit more parochial. That, by the way, is live footage of Lux celebrating when we sell a company inside of our offices. Famous quote, everybody knows to a cliched point that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Now, the people that invent it have changed over time. You go back 100 years, 1928, these were the people that were inventing it, mostly white guys in suits, very homogenous. This is Bell Labs. You let a few women in and maybe a minority, and you put them in lab coats, and now it's shifting a little bit more towards hardcore science, and then you get the freaks and geeks. Different Seattle company, but we've co-invested in a bunch of interesting things. If you ask these people, what was your inspiration, and you heard Jeff say this during his keynote before, the number one thing is typically science fiction. And the gap between sci-fi and sci-fact is shrinking, and we've cataloged this, and it's amazing, because sometimes you just go and you look through the archives of sci-fi or graphic novels or movies or books, and you're like, oh my God, somebody's about to invent that thing. So this gap between sci-fi and sci-fact, observably, undebatably, is shrinking. Now, either our scientists are becoming way more creative because the tools that they have compound exponentially, or our sci-fi authors are becoming less creative. Maybe it's a combination of both. Take the tricorder. This was the inspiration for the Motorola StarTAC. Take the phaser, which would beget the taser. Take Captain Picard, Star Trek Next Generation. Now, this is blasphemy. This is heresy in the tech world. Everybody believes Steve Jobs was an absolute genius. I think he was an amazing sci-fi archivist, because the iPad was presaged by Star Trek way before Steve Jobs ever released it. In fact, when Steve Jobs released FaceTime, his demo for it was literally taken out of 2001: Space Odyssey. HAL, Siri. On the top, Terminator. Visual scanning, augmented reality. On the bottom, one of our companies called IRA down in San Diego that's helping blind and visually impaired people using glasses that are effectively parlaying what information they're collecting and then being able to do visual recognition for people. Another one of our companies, Evolve, out of Boston, this is born out of Total Recall. So video frame rate, where you are able to walk through but have the same effect of millimeter wave scanning to detect aberrant materials. This is now live and installed. This is Lincoln Center in New York. This is for the DealBook conference earlier this year. Able to detect plastic explosives and guns and all kinds of things. Robotic surgery, Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, arm chopped off by Vader. On the top is Star Wars, and on the bottom is a company that we were early investors in called Oris. We just, about 2 months ago, sold this to Johnson & Johnson for just over $6 billion. Future of robotic surgery inspired entirely by science fiction. Again, Star Wars, we've got the holograms and Princess Leia on the bottom, a company between Brooklyn and Hong Kong called Looking Glass that's in our portfolio that's doing volumetric display. And you have to believe that just like with YouTube, you're going from 240 to 480p to 720 to 4K, that the resolution is going to continue to increase and applications will continue to expand. The replicator and 3D printing in its sort of crappy plastic form and then in more sophisticated ways. I'm going to skip some of these videos. We have a company called Desktop Metal, which does large-scale 3D metal printing, which is pretty amazing, and it's one of our fastest-growing businesses. A part of that, by the way, which I think is an incredibly important phenomenon, is generative design. And this is also at the crux of what we're all here for at this conference, which is being able to use computer and machine learning to be able to not just design something in 3 dimensions using CAD, but to basically set the parametric constraints and then let the machine evolve a design itself. And they're one of the leaders in that. Robots don't complain. You see this in manufacturing being replaced. Foxconn replacing workers with robots. And this also was presaged. Now, not quite by science fiction. I think we're fighting a losing game. Chocolate picking robots. I love Lucy, didn't stand a chance. Another cliche that we love, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. The beautiful thing about our jobs is that we get to find something that asymmetrically somebody knows about and the rest of the world doesn't know about it yet. Right? You find the scientist, you find the entrepreneur, you find the founder, and then it gets distributed to the masses, and in a sense we get to play this somewhat small role as a midwife to that process. It's very inspiring and humbling. I'm going to show you a few things that also lead to another phenomenon that I think can lead people to find incremental technological trends and big breakthroughs that we call 100-0-100. And I'll explain to you what those numbers mean. This is one of our companies up in Seattle called Kymeta. They were able to take effectively an electronic beam steering antenna with no moving parts. On the top left, you see a traditional satellite antenna. It has to lock on. If you had a geostationary satellite that was tracking onto Earth, you have to have a mechanical gimbal that moves and rotates, which is why you have crappy internet on a Google Wireless or Viasat on top of a plane, or if you're moving on a boat, train, plane, ship. And instead, if you had a flat panel array that you can just effectively beam steer, the same way our cell phone chips do as you switch from cell tower to cell tower, it'd be a pretty profound thing. So we were founding investors in that with Bill Gates, and I'll show you how this parlays from one company to another with a little bit of intellectual honesty. The 100 is the arrogant part, the 0 is the humble part, and the next 100 is the inspired part. The first 100 is I have 100% certainty that Lux will be investing in the most cutting edge shit that you can imagine over the next 2 years. The 0 part is the intellectual, honest, and humble part, which is we have no idea what those things are going to actually be. But we know where we will find them. And we will find them at the edge of our already cutting edge companies. By being in a boardroom with Bill Gates, you get an insight about a company, and then you go and chase that company down. And from that company, you get another company and another company. Ex post facto, it all seemed like this perfect linear chain of events, but a priori, you have no idea. And that's where the intellectual honesty, or at least the false intellectual honesty, comes from. This was first antenna that we rolled off the line in Bill's office.
So you guys use transmit? This is at a receiver.
That boardroom led us to an insight that there were a bunch of guys in San Francisco that some of you may have heard of. At the time, there was a company called Cosmogia, then it became called Planet Labs, now called Planet, that wanted to take these antennas and put them on very small satellites. And so those are the first CubeSats that they launched. They launched 3 of them, these little small boxes. They call them Alexander, Graham, and Bell, and then they got larger over time. They have now launched the largest constellation of Earth imaging satellites in history. So from an antenna company, it leads us to a satellite company. From the satellite company, and this is their launch, by the way, we go up on rockets, you can launch 30 or 50 at a time. And they have this phenomenon that they've called, just like in software, like agile development, they call it agile aerospace. And this is why they call it agile aerospace. Not supposed to happen. Now, the bad news is the rocket blew up. The good news is we had a very small amount of payload on there in a dollar basis. And so next month, you just go and you launch another one. This is when some of these small satellites, and you can see on the bottom right how small they are. You're going to hear from the CEO in a moment, when we docked with the International Space Station and these things being released into orbit.
This is a video of 2 of them being deployed from the International Space Station. It gives you a bit of a sense of the scale of them. I mean, it's like a little satellite.
Okay, so again, small antenna leads to a satellite company. Satellite company then gives us the insight, wait a second, the imagery is going to become really valuable. So we fund a company called Orbital Insight. And that company is taking all of the imagery that's coming off of drones and planes and satellites, whatever the platform is, and running analytics using ML and AI to sell it to global hedge funds and global macros and supplemental spy and government information. So one company in one area, this was a breakthrough area of physics, leads to another, and post facto, it's all obvious. But we are intellectually humbled that you never know. We never know if we're sitting next to somebody on the plane whose sister-in-law is going to be the CEO of some company that they're going to go back, and then we're going to find out that an engineer there is going starting something, and it's just completely random. So governing force in my life, I generally say, is randomness and optionality. Same thing here in drones. This is an area our partner Bilal, who's here, has led a lot of investments in, very interesting. On the top, same sci-fi and sci-fact phenomenon. This was Prometheus, in my view, an underrated prequel to Aliens. LiDAR, this orb going through this cavernous region, being able to detect and report back to the mothership situational awareness. On the bottom, you see the same sort of phenomenon with very crude early drones, basically using depth perception to tell you XYZ coordinates in the space. But this doesn't stop there, sci-fi and sci-fact. You've got pod racing on the top, and then you've got one of our companies called Drone Racing League. Now, by the way, anytime in our partnership meeting that you hear me utter the following words, it usually means it's going to be a good business. That's the stupidest fucking idea I've ever heard. And so that's my initial reaction on Drone Racing League. And this has literally and figuratively now taken off. Anyway, that one is a lot of fun, and if you've got kids that are basically 12 to 32, some of us are basically of that age mentally, it's a thrill. We have drones in space. We have them in the sky. We have them in sea and on land. This is another company in the Lex portfolio called Saildrone that are autonomous drones. You can think of these almost like datamarans, sending them out, missions as a service, replacing very large, expensive ships, and being able to have a fleet of these things globally. These things have encountered 100-foot waves, rogue waves, and they just flip over and capsize and are like indestructible. And the data that's coming off of these things is really powerful. And you get the same phenomenon where, just like Planet is trying to cover the globe from the sky, these guys are basically trying to cover every square nautical mile from the ocean, the seabed. And so this mapping, I think, is really interesting. And it's really interesting, and it's something I'll touch on as relates to mobile in a little bit, which is the key question to ask of any technology is not what happens when one exists, but what happens when everybody has one. When there is a network of these things, what is the phenomenon and the data and the opportunities that's coming off of brand new platforms? So again, this phenomenon of 100, 0, 100 leads in all of these cases to sort of our next thing. Zook was another example of this. You heard from Aisha this morning. We were early investors, and this was interesting because we had about $25 million invested in the early days. And we walk into a room about the size of the stage, and there's all these people that are sitting there playing video games. And I turned to the CTO and I said, what the hell are these people doing? We got a lot of money at work here. And he said, no, you don't understand. Outside, the vehicles, they're secretive vehicles, have all of these sensors that are basically ingesting from LiDAR and optics and vibrational sensors and thermal sensors and radar, and they're processing all of that at the rate of 1 second per second, what we all call reality. Inside, they're doing thousands of simulations a second, And the computer doesn't know the difference between reality and simulation because the physics engines are that good. And by the way, those two guys over there are from NVIDIA, and we have chips that aren't even on the market yet. That sent us 100, 0, 100 onto the next thing. And so you saw the videos this morning. I'm going to skip this. But it sent us looking for the next GPU chips. And I think Naveen Rao is here today, and you may have heard him from Nirvana. We became investors in Nirvana, and I'm out there publicly talking about how I think Intel is a company in secular decline. And within a year, I think 10 months after we invested, Intel ends up buying them for about $400 million with not a dollar of revenue yet or a product on the market. We never would have gotten the insight to hunt for this if it wasn't for that moment inside of this other secretive startup. So I think that one of the great takeaways from this is that the way to find the next thing is trying to find that asymmetric thing that nobody knows about and then find the problems that those people are trying to solve. This is another phenomenon in GPUs that I think is a fascinating one to us, the blurring line between reality and simulation. And you heard this earlier also from Aisha about how they're training vehicles, and you saw this with the 3D modeling of Ken, who was talking about the DexNet. It is a phenomenon writ large. The best example of this, if you haven't seen, is the time that Kobe entered the league as a rookie, the video quality, if you played NBA 2K, to the time when he retired. It was really hard to see that when he was, a rookie. And when he retired, the sweat drop has more computational complexity than the entire game. And so you can only imagine where this is going. Now, another phenomenon. The most dangerous words in investing. This time is different, okay? Because it never is. But there are more valuable words if you're an investor. Okay? Those words are, it'll rot your brain. Whenever these words are uttered by a parent, it presages the next $10 billion industry. Every time. 1950s rock and roll, devil's music, this is a $10 billion industry within 15 years. 60s, 70s, TV, 80s, internet chat rooms, it'll rot your brain. 90s, 2000s, these video gamers are today's robotic surgeons and drone pilots. And again, the transition from Pitfall to Mirror's Edge and insane multiplayer games, all powered by underlying hardware, semiconductors, GPUs. So this phenomenon of esports, I think, is going to lead to all kinds of other interesting things. I mentioned before this idea of when everyone has one, and this is a really important phenomenon. It's true with sail drones, it's true with large-scale satellites, it's true, of course, with mobile phones, and it's true with robotic surgery. Right? It's not what happens when a technology exists, it's what is the unpredictable social impact and the new platform opportunities that come from this. So we all bemoan our kids, stuck with their heads in their phones, but of course there's virtues of this. We have a company in New York, LA, expanding called Citizen, which is basically situational awareness. It's basically crime porn, tells you what's going on around you. It's at once thrilling and terrifying, but shines light, proverbial sunlight on situations. Of course, ride-sharing services, which also are interesting, because when a human gets into an accident, that human is unnetworked, okay? But when an autonomous vehicle or electric vehicles get into an accident, the network effect of these things allows for learning. When one car gets into an accident, a million other vehicles can learn. And this is true for any extensible hardware platform that's networked and connected. So not only with electric vehicles, but also with robotic surgery. So if you think about our company Oris that we sold to J&J for $6 billion, part of this is the idea that a surgeon might be able to haptically train a robot, and that robot in turn can then go and train other surgeons. And then a robot can learn and train another robot, and so on. You can see on the bottom, by the way, this sort of GPS-guided-like environment as it autonomously navigates through vascular tissue. Last thing I'm going to leave you with is a phenomenon that has probably captured me, and dangerously, because the partnership at Lux has to make sure we find disconfirming evidence so that we don't go over the edge and we get a diversity breakdown cognitively and everybody is saying one thing. We call this, amongst many of the directional arrows of progress that we look for, the half-life of technology intimacy. Now, when I say a directional arrow of progress, what I mean is that there are certain trends and phenomena through time. There is no debate that it is going that direction. You don't know who the entrepreneur is, you don't know who the company is, but it's improbable that it is going the other way. We are not going from fire to an incandescent bulb to an LED back to torches with sconces, sconces with torches in our conference rooms. We are not going from horses to horse-drawn carriages to manual vehicles to automatic to electric to autonomous back to horses in the streets. We're not going from spinning mechanical disks to solid-state drives and then back to physical spinning, whirling disks. And so one of these phenomena that we identified is the half-life of technology intimacy. It sounds a little weird, but I promise it's not. The basic idea is that every half-life technology gets closer to you. 50 years ago, you had a giant ENIAC computer, and you go and you physically go to this mainframe and you pull some plugs and push some levers. 25 years ago, first half-life, the dominant form is the desktop computer. You are tickling the keys, you have a mouse under your palm, you're pushing the on-off switch and flipping the monitor on. Then it's your laptop, 12 years ago, is the dominant form, now physically touching your thighs. 6.25 years ago, it's your phone. First thing you touch in the morning, last thing you touch at night, swiping, caressing, pinching, zooming. The only thing for men that separates it from your body is a thin film of fabric in your pants. 3 years ago, iWatch, 24 hours a day, constant contact with my skin, AirPods, now with compute. The directional arrow of progress, indisputably, is more and more intimacy with you, less of you hunching over a keyboard and more of the compute conforming to you. You see this with Alexa and Siri and Google. But gesture is the next wave, and the way that gesture is done today is with 3D depth sensing cameras. The way that gesture will be done in the near future is brain-machine interfaces. If you follow me on Twitter, you know I'm very critical of Tesla and in some cases Elon. The idea of a brain-machine interface tapped into your brain to me is insane because it massively underestimates how advanced the machine learning and the AI and the software and the hardware to be able to detect your neuromuscular intentions and be able to read those. So if you can think about every control system around us, whether it's this thing that I'm clicking, or it's a thermostat, or a knob, or a dial, or a lever, or a switch, or a slider, whether that is a physical thing or a virtualized thing, my body is telling my brain is telling my muscles, move that thing. But if instead I can pick up the signal of me actually wanting to move, then I can control that thing.
Just going to show you how we're able to actually decode just from the nerve itself what the hand is doing and create a biologically accurate hand virtually. All the fine digit movements, flexions and extensions. This is a hard problem, and I think it's impressive. What you'll see next is how we actually do something more complicated. What you're seeing here is my intention. I'm not moving, but the nerve is active, and I'm just trying to wave my hand back and forth without moving.
You can see how that can be mapped to any device in the world.
Here I'm showing the forces that I'm able to generate. This is just a simple grasp. And I actually have nice control over this, probably generate a number accurately between about 0 and 200. We're imagining what it's like now to take your hand virtually into VR. There's no cameras involved here. This is an always available you now, but this is me trying to type with some amount of spell correction, just kind of typing in the air.
All your interfaces are belong to us.
You'll see the device pop up on my arm here, and this is all your interface are belong to us. And this is the future. So neurocontrol is no longer about you moving, it's about you not moving. This is my co-founder, Patrick Kaifosh, playing Asteroids on a phone. Asteroids in the arcade took 2 hands. I wish we had the sound on right now because it's actually kind of fun, but the point is, he has incredibly fine continuous control over asteroids, 2.5 degrees of freedom. Very fine control out of 1 hand, and he's not moving at all. You'll have to take my word for it, there's a device on his arm there. And what's crazy is, he can train this in less than 60 seconds. De novo training. He's going to show you.
I'll stop there. Please email me, josh@lux.vc. Would love to hear some of the crazy things that you're working on, or if there are companies that you're involved in that our companies can work with you. Thank you guys so much.